So in this video, we're going to look at function operation, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and then function composition, which we'll see on the next slide. So here you'll see addition. Here's your formula. F plus g of x just means f of x plus g of x. Subtraction, f minus g of x is f of x minus g of x. And you'll see so far multiplication, it just means multiply them. Division, it just means divide them. Now this one has a little catch, the division, that says that g of x cannot equal 0, and that's just because I can't have a denominator of 0. That makes it undefined. Okay, so here's my function composition. F of g of x. So that little O in the middle, that means of. So this is take g and put it into f. So take g of x, put it into f. And you see I wrote off to the side, put function g into all of the x's for function f. Whatever that function may be, it's going to have, that's just its name. It's going to have some x's in there. And then g of f of x is just the opposite. You take f and you put it into g. So you put in function f into all the x's into function g. So what you have to remember with function composition is you always go to the inside first. You do that, and then you move out. Alright, so here's my two functions. F of x equals the square root of 2 plus 4x squared, and g of x equals x. So the first thing I'm going to do is addition. F plus g of x. You'll see I wrote the definition. It's f of x plus g of x. So every time I see an f of x, I'm going to write it in red. Every time I see a g of x, I'm going to write it in blue. So f of x is the square root of 2 plus 4x squared, and then g of x is x. And those two are being added. Now I can't combine x's and square roots. If you remember from Math 102, those aren't like terms. So that's actually where I'm done. The square root of 2 plus 4x squared plus x. That is your final answer. Okay, the next one says f minus g of x. So I wrote out the definition. That's f of x minus g of x. So f is the square root of 2 plus 4x squared. And if you're wondering where that's coming from, it's coming from this f right here. Each problem will have a different f and g. These all just happen to be referring to these two. So I have f minus g, which is x. Now sometimes if you have more than one thing with subtraction, especially, if you have more than one thing over here, you'll have to put parentheses and distribute. But because this is just an x, there's nothing to distribute. But be aware of that sometimes with subtraction, you'll need to put parentheses around your g. In this case, it's only one, so that's why I didn't need the parentheses. And again, that one's done because I can't combine square roots and x's. So that is my final answer. Okay, the next one says f of x times g of x, or f times g of x. So f of x is the square root of 2 plus 4x squared times x, which is just written like that. Now you may see it written like this with parentheses around them. I am fine with either notation. If you wanted to write the x first, that would be fine, because order doesn't matter over multiplication, so I'm fine with either one of those. And then the last one, f divided by g. So that's f of x over g of x. F of x is the square root of 2 plus 4x squared over g of x, which is x. So that's that. Okay? Now, in the next part, you'll see in some of the homework and certainly in the notes we talked about what's the domain of these things. The easiest way to find domain is your graphing calculator. You do not want to do this stuff in your head. Now remember, with a fraction, to find the domain of a fraction, so our last one, our f divided by g of x, we had the square root of 2 plus 4x squared all over x. That was on the previous, the last example. You can do this, all of these in your graphing calculator, but a shortcut to your fractions is just to set the denominator equal to 0. So if you remember that from Math 102, the denominator cannot be 0. So anytime you have a fraction, the easier way than going through your graphing calculator is going to be to take the denominator, set it equal to 0, and that just means that your graph will break at that. It's called a whole or an asymptote. Now, certainly if you do all of them in your graphing calculator, it will work just the same. But the way you do it in your graphing calculator, click the y equals button, type in the equation, make sure you type it in just like it appears. So some of these buttons, some of these functions in terms of like the cubed root are going to be under the math menu. So if you're looking for the cubed root, it is the button math and then number 4. Same thing with absolute value, but for the most part, these things are also, there's shortcuts on your keyboard, like squared, cubed root, or square root, squared. But those are the two that are big. Check under the math menu. So you're going to type in the equation, and then you're going to click graph. Once you click graph, it may take a second. If nothing happens instantly, just give it a moment. You're graphing some crazy functions sometimes. Look at the graph, and then how far left does it go? How far right does it go? That will be your domain. Your graphing calculator has arrows on the end, even if you don't see them, so keep that in mind as well. All right, so here's my last function composition. F of g of x means take g and put it into f. Okay, so I like to write my g in here first. So g of x is the blue function, which I got that from right here. That's g. So where there was a g of x, I replace it with x because that's what it says. Now I take x and I plug it in everywhere I see an x. So this one's kind of basic, if you will. So I'm going to plug this in to f everywhere I see an x. So I had the square root of 2 plus 4 x squared, and I'm plugging in g of x, which is x. So you actually end up having the same equation. And that's only because g of x is x, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's my final answer. I can't simplify that thing down anymore. Now my other way, g of f of x, says take g, or take f and plug it into g. So what's f? This thing right here. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to replace it where there was an f of x in my problem. Okay, so now everywhere I see an x in g, I'm going to fill it in with that thing right there. So in this case, there's only an x. So where there was an x, I'm going to replace it with a 2 plus 4x squared. And that is my final answer. So I plugged that into G. Okay, hope this helped.